Father's Day was supposed to be simple. Rhett Calloway had not asked for a podium, a nameplate, or a seat at any particular table. He had only asked to sit close enough to the stage so that when his daughter looked up from her letter, she would find his face in the crowd. That was the whole plan. One folded piece of paper in a child's handwriting, one man in a worn button-down shirt, one afternoon that was supposed to belong entirely to the quiet kind of love that never announces itself. But when CEO Tessa Holloway looked across the glittering ballroom of the Meridian Grand and saw a man without a title badge, without a tailored suit, without any visible marker of importance, she made a decision in under 10 seconds that would cost her everything she had spent a decade building. Rhett did not argue. He took his daughter's hand, stood up, and walked toward the door. What happened next was something no one in that room would forget. If you stay until the very end of this story, you will understand why the most powerful person in that ballroom was the one nobody recognized. The Meridian Grand Hotel sat along the Chicago waterfront like a declaration of arrival, its brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine, its lobby smelling of white lilies and laundered linen, every surface chosen to communicate one thing above all others, that the people inside mattered. On the morning of Father's Day, the hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into what Holloway Meridian Group's events team called an immersive appreciation experience. Crystal chandeliers hung low over circular tables draped in champagne linen. Each place setting included a handwritten name card and a custom-branded keepsake box. The flower arrangements alone had cost more than most of the company's junior coordinators earned in a month. Tessa Holloway had approved every line of the budget without blinking, because this was not merely a party. This was a statement. The board of directors was reviewing her contract renewal in 72 hours, and she intended to walk into that vote having demonstrated, publicly and visibly, that she was the kind of leader who understood the value of family, community, and the human element of corporate culture. Rhett Calloway arrived at 11:45, slightly early, holding the hand of his 8-year-old daughter June. He wore a pale blue Oxford shirt that had been pressed but had seen too many wash cycles to hold its shape perfectly. His shoes were leather, dark brown, scuffed at the toe in the way that working shoes inevitably become. He carried no briefcase, wore no watch anyone would glance twice at, and had no assistant walking 3 steps behind him. At the registration table, he gave his name and received a lanyard that read simply, "Rhett Calloway, guest parent." The young man who handed it over did so without looking up. Rhett thanked him anyway. June tugged her father's sleeve and asked which table they were at, and Rhett read the number from the card and led her through the crowd with the easy, unhurried calm of a man who had long since stopped measuring rooms by the quality of their chandeliers. The hotel's event coordinator, Delaney Brooks, had placed June near the front because June was one of 7 children selected to read letters to their fathers during the ceremony's highlight segment. Delaney had cross-referenced the children's seating assignments with their parents' arrivals and quietly shifted Rhett and June to a table at the edge of the VIP zone, not inside the reserved core, but adjacent to it, close enough that June would not have to navigate the full length of the ballroom to reach the stage steps. It was a practical decision made with no fanfare, the kind of small kindness that event staff extend every day without expecting acknowledgement. Rhett noticed it immediately. He leaned over to Delaney as she passed with her clipboard and said, simply and quietly, that he appreciated the thought. Delaney blinked, slightly surprised that he had noticed at all, and told him June was going to do beautifully. June, for her part, was gripping the sealed envelope in both hands, as though it might try to escape. Rhett settled into his seat, ordered a glass of water, and watched the room fill. He had been in ballrooms like this before. Not recently, but before. He knew how they worked, who sat where, what the arrangement of tables communicated about power and proximity. He did not feel diminished by his placement. He felt, if anything, quietly comfortable being unremarkable in a space that rewarded visibility. He had chosen this kind of invisibility deliberately, years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with love. He listened to the ambient music, watched the flowers catch the light, and thought about what he wanted to say to June after her letter. Not about the ceremony, not about the audience, but about the fact that she had written something and found the courage to say it out loud. That, to him, was the only event worth attending. Across the ballroom, Tessa Holloway was being photographed against a floral installation that the design team had built specifically as a backdrop for executive portraits. She smiled for the camera with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to perform warmth rather than feel it. Her communications director, Cassidy Monroe, stood nearby reviewing the afternoon's run of show and reminding Tessa of the key talking points for her opening remarks. The room was full. The press had arrived. The board members were seated at the Central Reserve tables. Everything looked exactly the way Tessa needed it to look. 20 minutes before the program began, Tessa walked the room in the way that people in her position often do, not to see others, but to be seen seeing others. She moved from table to table, offering handshakes and the kind of attention that expires the moment she turned away. She passed the Central Reserved section, past the donor tables, past the senior management clusters, and then her eye caught something that disrupted her visual inventory of the space. A man in a plain blue shirt was seated at the edge of the VIP adjacency zone, close enough to the reserved section to suggest deliberate placement, but wearing nothing that justified it. No badge of significance, no greeting card of status. Just a man and a small girl, the girl clutching an envelope with both hands like a secret. Tessa did not stop walking, but something tightened in her expression. She found Delaney Brooks near the stage steps and pulled her aside with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to giving corrections. She asked, in a voice precise enough to carry weight but low enough to pass as casual, why a guest parent-level attendee had been seated in proximity to the VIP section. Delaney explained the situation clearly. June was one of the reading participants. The seating adjustment was logistical, and the placement was a courtesy to a child who was performing, not a status assignment for the parent. Tessa's response was a single word of acknowledgement that communicated none of the acknowledgement it implied. She looked back across the room at Rhett and did not see a parent of a performing child. She saw a poorly dressed man in the wrong part of the room, and she decided the optics were wrong. The concern, as Tessa framed it to herself, was coherent. This event was being filmed, photographed, and attended by investors, board members, and press. The brand image of Holloway Meridian was built on precision, sophistication, and the projection of a particular kind of success. She had approved every visual element of the event to communicate that image. And now there was an element she had not approved. She told Delaney that the placement needed to be corrected. Delaney hesitated, explaining again that moving June would put the child farther from the stage steps and could add unnecessary stress before her reading. Tessa heard the words and processed none of them. She said the issue was not the child. It was the placement of the child's parent. Rhett had not been listening, exactly, but in the way of people who have learned to be aware of rooms, he had registered the conversation happening at his periphery without turning to look. He knew when a discussion concerned him. June had also noticed, in the hypersensitive way of children who have learned to read adult tension, that someone was unhappy with their presence. She leaned close to her father and asked, very quietly, if they were in the wrong place. Rhett put his hand over hers on the table and told her they were exactly where they were supposed to be. He said sometimes people made judgments before they had enough information, but that those judgments said nothing useful about the person being judged. June considered this for a moment and then asked if they still got to eat the little bread rolls. Rhett said yes, "Absolutely," and moved the breadbasket closer to her side of the table. Tessa approached the table herself, flanked by no one, which she believed gave her interaction the quality of graciousness rather than confrontation. She introduced herself to Rhett by title and offered a smile that had been engineered over many professional years to suggest warmth while creating distance. She said she understood he was June's father and what a lovely thing for June to be participating today. And she just wanted to clarify that the seating in this section was designated for specific guest categories, and she hoped he would understand. Rhett offered her the lanyard card. Tessa glanced at it and handed it back. She said the issue wasn't the invitation itself, just the specific placement, and that Delaney would be happy to help them find seats in the general section where they would have a lovely view. Rhett did not raise his voice. He asked her, very evenly, whether June's seat near the stage steps was also going to be relocated. Tessa said that was a separate matter, and they would ensure June could access the stage from another route. June looked at her father with an expression that was trying very hard not to be frightened. Cassidy Monroe had moved to a position where she could hear the conversation without appearing to monitor it. She recognized, with the professional alertness of someone whose job required reading social temperatures, that the exchange was carrying a register she did not like. She considered intervening. She weighed the possibility of a correction against the certainty that Tessa did not receive corrections gracefully in public. She chose silence. It was a choice she would spend the next several hours revising. The program began at noon with a short welcome video that played on 3 large screens at the front of the ballroom, images of smiling employees and their families moving past with a soundtrack designed to suggest warmth and belonging. Tessa took the stage to applause that was enthusiastic from the rows of employees who knew they were being watched, and genuine from no one in the room with any real awareness of what was unfolding at the edge of the VIP section. She spoke about the company's values with the fluency of someone who had delivered the same sentences in many rooms and believed that fluency was the same as conviction. She mentioned family twice, legacy once, and the privilege of working alongside people who brought their whole selves to their roles. The language was good. The staging was excellent. The board members at the central tables watched with the attentive neutrality of people who were also evaluating the performer. Behind the scenes, a member of Tessa's communications team had flagged to her, via a brief text message, that one of the wide-angle camera operators was positioned in a way that would capture the edge of the adjacent seating zone during the letter-reading segment. The camera would, in standard panning, sweep across Rhett. The team member had flagged this not as a problem, but as information. Tessa read it as a crisis. She messaged back with a single instruction, handle it. And then, rather than wait for the handling, she walked off the stage during the transitional music and spoke directly to the venue's head of security. The instruction she gave was framed as a guest management correction, a minor logistical adjustment, and delivered with the confident authority of someone who expected it to be implemented without further discussion. The security officer, a tall man named Marcus who had spent 17 years managing events and knew, instinctively, when a direction was going to cause a problem, nevertheless executed the instruction because he had not been given any information that would allow him to push back. He walked over to Rhett's table during the transitional music and bent down to speak quietly. What Marcus said to Rhett was, the event management team had asked that guests in this section present documentation of their VIP designation, and that without that documentation, he would need to move to the general seating area. He said it without pleasure. Rhett listened without expression. June, whose instincts about adult conversations were excellent, looked up from her bread roll and asked Marcus if she was still going to read her letter. Marcus said he didn't know, which was honest. and which broke something briefly in June's face before she smoothed it back into composure with a resilience that was clearly, visibly, her father's. Tessa arrived at the table before Marcus could complete the exchange. She had clearly decided that waiting for a report was slower than managing the situation herself. She looked at Rhett with the expression of someone performing patience and said she appreciated his understanding and that the event had very specific protocols, and she hoped this was not making his afternoon uncomfortable. Rhett looked at her for a moment before he spoke, and in that moment he appeared to be deciding something. He asked her whether she was certain she wanted to do this here, today, on this particular day in front of his daughter. Tessa said she was protecting the integrity of the event. Rhett said that what she was doing was teaching his daughter something about how the world works, and he was not sure it was a lesson worth the venue. Tessa said that was not her concern. Rhett stood. He was not a tall man, but he stood with the kind of steadiness that comes from having nothing left to prove. He buttoned the center button of his shirt, straightened it once, and looked down at June. He told her that sometimes the most dignified response to a room that has made itself small is to walk into a bigger one. June did not fully understand this, but she stood up anyway, took her father's hand, and held the envelope very carefully against her chest. They walked toward the door together, and the walk was unhurried, and no one who watched it could explain afterward why it felt, in that moment, like watching something important leave the room. At the VIP table, Vaughn Mercer, who had been chairman of the Holloway Meridian Board for 11 years, and who had known Rhett Callaway for longer than the company had existed in its current form, watched this departure with an expression that his colleagues would later describe variously as pale, still, or grave. He set down his water glass. Beside him, Sterling Quinn, the company's CFO, saw Vaughn's face and turned to follow his gaze. And then Sterling's expression shifted into something that combined discomfort with rapidly escalating comprehension. Around the table, others began to notice the quality of attention being paid by the two men at the center of it. Vaughn Mercer pushed back his chair. He stood, smoothed his jacket, and walked toward the door. He did not look at Tessa. He did not say anything to the table. Sterling stood up 3 seconds later and followed. Then, in the way of bodies responding to signals that precede language, 2 more board members rose. Then an outside counsel. Then the fund representative from the largest institutional stakeholder in the company's capital structure. By the time the 6th person had stood and walked toward the door, the MC had faltered mid-sentence. The ambient music continued, obliviously, for several more seconds before someone had the presence of mind to cut it. Tessa Holloway stood at the edge of the stage left wing and watched the most important table in the room empty itself with the quiet finality of a tide going out. The confusion she felt was genuine, and genuine confusion was not an expression she wore often or well. She did not yet understand what she had done, only that she had done something that was producing consequences she could not read. She stepped forward and moved toward Vaughn Mercer, who had paused near the door and was looking down the hallway toward the exit. She reached him and asked, with the controlled tone of someone who had not yet admitted to herself that she was frightened, what was happening. Vaughn looked at her for a moment. He said, "You just removed the only person with the authority to save this company from a very expensive mistake." Tessa said she did not understand. Vaughn said he was aware of that and walked through the door. In the hallway outside the ballroom, the lighting was softer, the working light of a hotel corridor rather than the engineered glow of an event space. Rhett had found a bench near a window that looked out onto the hotel's courtyard garden, and he and June were sitting there, June with the envelope in her lap, unopened, looking at it the way children look at things they are not yet sure they are allowed to grieve. Rhett had his arm around her. He was speaking to her in a voice too low to carry across the hallway. She was listening with the focused gravity of a child who is working hard to be brave. Vaughn, Sterling, and the rest of the board members who had followed filed into the hallway and spread out along its width, not approaching, not interrupting, standing at a respectful remove. One of them had the sensitivity to gesture to the others to stay quiet. And so they stood, these people who ran portfolios and sat on audit committees and approved quarterly earnings reports, in a hotel hallway on Father's Day afternoon, and they waited. June looked up at her father and said that she had written the letter for him, and she still wanted him to hear it. She said it didn't need a stage. Rhett said he would be honored to hear it anywhere. June straightened her back the way she had practiced, held the envelope at the bottom, and unfolded the pages with careful hands, and began to read in the clear, slightly formal voice of a child who has rehearsed enough to be ready, but not so much that the feeling has been replaced by performance. She said her father was not the loudest person in any room she had ever been in, and she had noticed that, and she had sometimes wondered when she was younger if it meant he was less than the people who were louder. But she had decided it meant the opposite. She said her father had left a meeting she could not name so that she would not be the only person without a parent at her school's spring recital. She said he had stayed awake through 2 nights when she had a fever that would not break, and she had woken up in the early morning both times to find him sitting in the chair beside her bed, awake, not because he had to be, but because he had decided not to leave. She said he told her once that being a father was the job that had no days off, and no performance reviews, and no one would ever put your name on a building for doing it, but that it was the only work he had ever done that he was certain, completely certain, was worth every single hour. The hallway was very quiet. Several of the board members were looking at the floor. Vaughn Mercer was looking at the window. Sterling Quinn had his hands in his jacket pockets and was very still. Delaney Brooks had come out after the board members and was standing near the door with her clipboard held against her chest. When June finished reading, she folded the letter back along its original creases, returned it to the envelope, and looked up at her father. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her close and said quietly that she had done beautifully. Tessa Holloway stood at the far end of the hallway. She had followed, eventually, because she had no other option that would not have looked like a more deliberate form of abandonment. She stood with her arms at her sides and watched a child read a letter to her father in a hotel corridor because she had decided that the father's shirt was the wrong kind of shirt for her event. Sterling Quinn was the one who explained it, and he did so in the measured, effectless voice of a person who delivers information as a professional obligation regardless of its emotional temperature. He told Tessa, in the corridor, with several board members present, that Rhett Callaway was the original architect of the integrated logistics platform that Holloway Meridian had licensed and expanded over the previous 8 years. That platform was currently the central technical infrastructure in the company's bid for a federal infrastructure contract valued at $800 million. The bid was in final review. The approval required, as a condition of the original licensing agreement, the sign-off of the platform's founding stakeholder, a right Rhett had retained quietly when he had stepped back from executive operations 6 years earlier to take primary custody of his daughter following the death of his wife. Tessa said nothing for a moment. Then she said she had not been told any of this. Sterling said she had been told Rhett would be at the event and that the board had specifically arranged his attendance for reasons connected to the contract. He said the briefing document had been sent to her office 3 weeks prior. There was a silence. Tessa said she remembered the document but had not recognized the name as connected to a specific attendance. Sterling looked at her with the expression of someone who has just watched an argument dismantle itself from the inside and said only that he understood. Vaughn Mercer spoke next. He said the practical situation was this. The contract window closed in 12 days. Rhett's sign-off was needed within that window, and Rhett had, as of 40 minutes ago, been asked to leave the building on the instruction of the company's chief executive. He said the board would need to address this, but he wanted first to address something else. He turned to Rhett directly, and in front of everyone present, he apologized. Not for the company, not as a corporate formality. He said he was personally sorry that Rhett had been treated this way in a place where he had every right to be, and that the fact he had retained his composure and his focus on his daughter throughout was a reflection of a quality of character that the company had, clearly, not deserved today. Rhett accepted this with a single nod. He did not expand on it. He looked at Tessa and he asked her the question he had asked in the ballroom, again, in the corridor, with more witnesses and more clarity. If he had come in with no equity, no rights, no contract weight, nothing but a guest lanyard and a child who wanted to read a letter, would she have done the same thing? Tessa started to construct an answer and then stopped, because she recognized that every available answer was either dishonest or damning, and she was not ready yet to be either. The silence that followed this question was not the silence of a room waiting for resolution. It was the silence of a room in which a set of people understood simultaneously that they had been operating under a leader whose definition of value was not compatible with any version of culture they wanted to inhabit. Cassidy Monroe, who had said nothing for the past hour, looked at the floor and understood that her own silence over many months had made her a participant rather than a bystander. Vaughn called the emergency session in the hotel's private meeting room, a side chamber off the main corridor that had been reserved by the board as a working space for the day. He gave Tessa the opportunity to address the group directly. She took it, and she was articulate, and she covered the ground she needed to cover. Her record, the revenue figures, the partnerships she had brokered, the strategies she had implemented over her tenure. She spoke for 11 minutes. The board listened without interruption. Then Sterling Quinn opened his folder and presented, without commentary, a parallel set of numbers. Revenue growth over the period, adjusted for the organic momentum of the platform infrastructure that had existed before Tessa's leadership. Client retention figures, with specific attention to 3 major partnerships that had lapsed in the previous 2 years, each departure correlated with internal culture complaints documented in exit interviews. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were not on their own a dismissal case. But they were a narrative, and the narrative said that the company was coasting on a foundation it had stopped maintaining. Cassidy Monroe spoke next. She described 3 separate instances over the previous 18 months in which she had produced brand communication materials that were revised by Tessa's office to remove the faces of hourly employees, logistics drivers, and facility workers in favor of images of senior leadership and curated stock photography. She said the reason she had not objected more forcefully at the time was that she had been told the brand needed to project aspiration, and she had accepted that framing. She said she no longer accepted it. She said the cumulative effect of those decisions was a public-facing identity for the company that its own workforce did not recognize as their own, and that people could tell the difference between a company that valued them and a company that performed the valuing. Delaney Brooks was asked, at Rhett's suggestion, to speak briefly. She was a junior coordinator who had been hired 18 months ago. She spoke for 4 minutes. She said she had learned, in her first month, which categories of people to be very careful around because of how they were likely to be treated if a senior executive noticed them. She said she had tried, today, to do the right thing for June and for Rhett, and had been overridden. She said she had wanted, multiple times in the past year and a half, to raise concerns through internal channels, but the structure of those channels made it very clear that raising concerns was a professional risk rather than a protected act. She said this as plainly as she could, without drama, and sat down. Tessa said, during her response to these accounts, that she had always operated with the company's best interests at the center of her decisions. She said that culture was built over time, not in single incidents, and that a broader review was appropriate if the board felt one was warranted. She said she took responsibility for the communication lapses, while noting that the execution of brand decisions involved teams of people making daily choices. The board recognized, collectively, and without needing to discuss it, that what they were watching was a person redistributing the weight of a mistake rather than carrying it. Rhett spoke once. He said the question was not whether Tessa was a capable executive. That was for the board to answer, if they chose to. He said the question he was asking was different. What kind of company did they want to be the week after today, and the month after, and the year after, and whether the answer to that question was compatible with the current leadership. He said he was not asking for anyone to be punished. He was asking for the board to take responsibility for the culture they had endorsed. Then he sat back and said nothing more. The vote was closed ballot. Vaughn had insisted on this, partly to protect individual members from perceived coercion, and partly because he understood that sealed processes produced more honest results than open ones. The paper ballots were collected, counted by the board's external counsel, and read aloud. The motion before the board was to suspend Tessa Holloway's executive authority pending a formal operational and cultural review, with Vaughn Mercer assuming interim authority during the review period. 7 of 9 eligible votes were in favor, 2 abstentions, no opposing votes. Tessa sat very still when the count was read. She had prepared herself for the possibility of this outcome. The preparation had been happening somewhere below her conscious awareness for the past 40 minutes. But the preparation did not soften the landing of the actual number. She had expected, perhaps, a closer outcome. She had expected that her track record, her professional relationships, her years of visible effort would generate enough loyalty to at least create a divided vote. 7-0 with 2 abstentions was not a divided vote. It was a consensus about something she had not intended to put to a vote. Vaughn told her the review would be conducted fairly, that she retained all legal rights through the process, and that the board's action was not a termination but a pause. Tessa nodded once. She asked Rhett directly whether this outcome was what he had wanted when he walked out of the ballroom. Rhett said no. He said what he had wanted when he walked out of the ballroom was for his daughter to be able to read her letter. He said the rest of it had happened because other people in the room had made choices he had no control over. Tessa looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the door. She said she needed some air, which is the kind of thing people say when they need the conversation to end without having to formally end it, and the board allowed it because the voting was over and the formal business was done. She walked out into the corridor, and there, still sitting on the bench by the courtyard window, was June. June was working on a small sketch in the margins of the envelope, drawing something with a pen she had borrowed from Delaney. She did not look up when Tessa passed, not because she was being deliberate, but because she was absorbed in her drawing. Tessa slowed. Then she stopped. She stood and watched a child draw a picture on the back of a letter about her father, and something moved through her that she did not have a name for, but that made the skin around her eyes tighten in a way that had nothing to do with professional calibration. Vaughn asked Rhett if he would be willing to return to the ballroom, and specifically whether he would allow June to take the stage she had been prepared for. Rhett considered this for a moment, and then said he would, but he had one condition. The staging needed to come down. The lights and effects and the formal ceremony structure, if June was going to read her letter again, it should be in a room that felt like a room, not a production. Vaughn agreed without hesitation. He went ahead to arrange it. When Rhett and June appeared at the ballroom door, The shift in the room's energy was immediate and wordless. The guests who had stayed, which was most of them, because the strange departure of the board had been too interesting to leave, turned toward the entrance with the collective attentiveness of people who understood they were watching the second act of something. The staged lighting had been softened. The circular screens had been dimmed. The stage remained, but the formal lectern had been moved aside, and someone had placed a simple standing microphone at the front of the platform in its place. June walked up the stage steps with her father's eyes on her from the first row. She had the envelope in both hands again, and she held it the way she had held it in the corridor, carefully, the way you carry something you know has weight. She introduced herself into the microphone in the slightly loud, slightly fast voice of a child who is concentrating very hard on something else, and then she began to read. The room was very quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when they understand that something true is being said. She read everything she had read in the hallway and more. She had added 2 lines at the end, written in the margins in the pen she had borrowed from Delaney, while she sat on the bench. She said, "My father once told me that showing up is the most important thing a person can do. He has shown up every single time. I hope this letter shows up for him." When she finished, the silence held for 2 full seconds before it broke into applause. Not the applause of a managed event, not the timed, cued response to a stage direction, but the kind that starts from individual people deciding, separately and simultaneously, that they want to make sound. Rhett stood in the first row. He did not clap. He put his hand over his chest and looked at his daughter, and everyone who saw his face understood that whatever had happened in the previous 2 hours, this was the part that mattered. Cassidy had quietly instructed her team to cut the commercial lighting effect and had told the camera operators to keep the frame wide and human and to stop treating the event like a brand shoot. The result was a ballroom that, for the first time that day, looked like a place where people actually were, rather than a place where an idea of people had been installed. Rhett spoke for under 2 minutes. He said, standing at the front of the room without a lectern or notes, that he had been thinking about what he wanted a company to be. He said he did not think a company needed to choose between excellence and humanity, that the choice itself was a false one, and that the habit of treating human beings as set pieces in a larger image was not a branding error. It was a moral posture, and it had consequences. He said he hoped the people in the room would carry something from Father's Day that was not in any of the official event materials. He stepped away from the microphone. June found him at the bottom of the stage steps and took his hand. The contract review session was scheduled for Tuesday morning, 6 days before the federal window closed. Rhett arrived alone, on time, with no team. He sat across from Vaughn Mercer and Sterling Quinn, and a legal representative from the contracting authority, and answered questions for 2.5 hours with the patient thoroughness of a person who had built the system being discussed and understood every component of it from the inside. He signed the approval documents at 11:47 in the morning. The contract was submitted before the close of business. The value of the engagement, across its full term, was confirmed at $800 million. The conditions attached to his signature were formal and binding. The company was required to establish an internal family support initiative, specifically structured to include resources for single parents, flexible scheduling frameworks, and emergency care provisions. The company was required to commission an independent cultural audit conducted by an external firm, with the findings made available to all staff. The company was required to issue a public statement, not a press release framed as positive brand content, but a direct acknowledgement, drafted in plain language, that the organization had identified failures in how it treated the people who made up its workforce, and was taking specific and measurable steps to correct them. Rhett did not negotiate on these conditions. He presented them as written. The board accepted them without revision. 12 weeks after Father's Day, the changes inside Holloway Meridian Group were visible in ways both statistical and atmospheric. Sterling Quinn's quarterly report noted that voluntary turnover had decreased by nearly a third compared with the same period the previous year, that 3 clients who had allowed contracts to lapse had re-engaged in preliminary conversations, and that the employee satisfaction survey, conducted for the first time with responses allowed to be anonymous and unfiltered, had returned results markedly more candid and, in their candor, more useful than any previous version. Delaney Brooks had been moved from event coordination into a newly created role within the culture and operations team, a position that existed partly because someone had listened to a 4-minute account from a junior coordinator and decided that what she had described was a structural problem rather than a personnel one. Cassidy Monroe had redesigned the company's visual identity from the inside out, building a campaign around actual employees in actual workplaces, and the response from clients had been, according to every metric the team tracked, significantly better than anything the previous aspirational imagery had achieved. Tessa Holloway completed the review process and was offered a restructured role at a different level of the organization, one with significant scope but without executive authority. She declined it. She sent a private letter to Rhett's office 2 weeks after the review concluded. The letter was short. She said she had spent the weeks following Father's Day attempting to reconstruct the logic of her decisions that afternoon, and had found, at the end of that reconstruction, that the logic was not actually present, that what she had called brand management and event standards and professional protocol was, when she looked at it directly, something simpler and less defensible. She said she did not expect this acknowledgement to repair anything, and was not sending it with that expectation. She said she thought June's letter was one of the most honest things she had heard in a professional setting in many years, and she was sorry that her actions had almost prevented it from being read. Rhett read the letter twice. He set it on his desk. He did not respond to it immediately, because he did not believe that forgiveness was something that should be offered quickly when the person doing the forgiving was not the only one who had been wronged. June was 8. She would carry the memory of being asked to leave a room with her father for reasons she could not understand, and she would work out the meaning of it over time, and Rhett believed that the meaning she arrived at on her own would be more useful to her than any resolution he could arrange. He filed the letter in a drawer and returned to his afternoon. The following Father's Day, there was no gala. Holloway Meridian's event committee had proposed one and then, after some discussion, had decided against it. Instead, the company held an outdoor gathering in a public park. Blankets on the grass, a food truck, children running loose between the adults, name badges optional and ignored. Vaughn Mercer arrived with his son, who was 26 and had flown in from Seattle. Sterling Quinn brought a folding chair and a cooler of drinks. Cassidy Monroe took photographs on her phone that she did not retouch before posting them internally, because they were true, and truth had become the standard. Rhett arrived with June, who was 9 now, and carrying a book rather than an envelope. She had decided, apparently, that she had said what she needed to say the previous year and was moving on to other projects. She found a patch of grass near a tree and settled in to read. Rhett sat beside her. Vaughn found him there later in the afternoon and lowered himself to the grass with the careful effort of a man who had not sat on grass in some time, and he asked Rhett, because he had been wanting to ask for many months, whether Rhett regretted stepping away from executive life when he had. Whether any part of him missed the rooms. Rhett looked at June, who had placed her book face down on her knee and was watching 2 dogs chase each other across the park. He said he thought about it sometimes. He said there were rooms he had walked out of voluntarily and others he had been asked to leave, and he had found, in his experience, that the ones he had been asked to leave were rarely rooms worth staying in. He said the rooms that mattered were not decorated with chandeliers and name card placements and camera angles. They were the rooms where someone stayed awake in a chair beside you when the fever wouldn't break. They were the rooms where a child decided her letter was worth reading even if the only audience was a bench in a hotel corridor. He said he had never once regretted the choice he made when June needed him more than any meeting did. He said there were rooms that looked like everything and held nothing, and rooms that looked like nothing and held everything, and he had learned to tell the difference. June looked up from the dogs, noticed both men watching her, and said, "What?" Rhett said nothing. He just smiled at her. She considered this for a moment, decided it required no further investigation, and returned to her book. The afternoon continued around them. Laughter, children, the low murmur of a company learning, slowly and imperfectly, to recognize the people inside it. And the man who had once been asked to leave was now, simply and without announcement, the still center of the whole thing.
Carlos! What's up, bro? I'm dead. I'm already at all out of health. Alright, I'm going to level up first. God damn it. How you doing, Carlos? Who's the other boss? I'm doing great, Raz. Thanks for asking, bro. Before crossing the bridge, go left. You're just eating, chilling right now? That's what's up, bro. Hell yeah. How about you, my love? I actually just finished eating. Now I'm chilling. And what am I going to do? Yeah. Work was good today. Thank you so much for asking, Eddie. I appreciate you, my brother. This is going to be a fun game. Yep. How did you know, Carlos? Who told you? What's up, Craig? How you doing, bro? Who told you I was going to have pizza? Who's saying my love, but it's Carlos. That's cool. Nick's got to fight. Track the IP. I just know you. What's up, Nicholas? Where's Rogman at? Top 3 games I ever played. It is a great game. It's like one of my favorite Souls games for sure. Love you guys. Let's get it. There we go. Okay, before the bridge, go left.